Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Mr. Schoener, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. Do you mind reintroducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
I'm Gary Schoener. I'm a clinical psychologist in Minneapolis, and I worked on the JFK assassination many years ago.
Worked on it. Oh my goodness. You were around so many people that are like just names that pop up all over the place when it comes to research into the assassination. Have you noticed it's been trending more when it comes to media being able to talk about it a little bit more openly than maybe the past years?
Well, yeah, except I don't know how to characterize it. I've noticed it's coming up around even non-anniversary times. I don't quite know why. And also, I've been called by some people working on books and things. For whatever reason, it pops up periodically, and I don't think it's a rhyme or reason to it, but it's relatively clear it's not a dead topic by a long shot. And but what's happening, I don't know. But I've been struck by the fact it keeps coming up one place or the other in the news.
Well, how easy is it to research now with the basis of the internet compared to maybe how it was when you were doing it?
No, totally different. I mean, the reality is, first of all, the amount of stuff posted up there is incredible. Secondly, the other thing that's happened as people have died, like Harold Weisberg, what's happened is that they've donated their papers to universities, and now there are things that people can go out and research. So what you have is two things. You have the internet permitting rapid sharing of information and the sharing of tons of information, and you have more places to access it that are putting it out. Still tons of stuff that are things that are inaccessible, of course, but
Do you believe in shadow banning, like people being able to block certain things? I don't know if you got the photo I sent you through email, but I make clips for YouTube. You have a couple clips up there, and they're about various topics. Some are about specific stuff in the JFK assassination, and I make clips for everything, ADHD, anything you can possibly think of. And the clips I would normally share, the link comes out with the title of the clip, and then the actual says YouTube, and that has a couple numbers after it. All my specific JFK links say JFK percent sign, title of the thing percent sign, then another couple things percent sign. They all have percent signs inserted into it. That's shadow banning because usually when you Google JFK Parkland Hospital and hit videos, my clips would pop up. They're 1 minute long, so they go to the top of the charts, and it was very easy to find. You can't do that after maybe a couple weeks now. And I just noticed it after the media started talking about it more that it was a form of shadow banning. And I'm not saying it's just me specifically. I'm sure it's the whole topic in general, but it doesn't touch the RFK subject. That those links come out normal like all the others. So it's just specifically the JFK subject.
that's fascinating. And again, interesting to know what the heck's going on.
Well, what does it do when it comes to research? If we're talking about using the internet to look up stuff, eventually it's just going to be like you can't find it.
Well, or give you a false sense of security that you've checked everything over, and what you didn't know, there was a bunch of other stuff out there that just wasn't available.
Are you hesitant on some of these researchers donating their materials to universities? Because I get a little bit nervous that someone could just go by and like your experience at the archives, like just something that's not there. It's just like, what do you mean it's not there? Withdrawn for national security, that good old term.
Well, I don't really know, except there's no question that over time, people have found different ways to eliminate information or make it inaccessible. That's not a new phenomenon, but it is sounds like it's taking different forms now in our information age.
Were you aware of it back then happening, or maybe do you believe it was
Well,
low key
back then, the
happening?
main thing was that documents weren't available or things were never, in fact, made into documents. We know there, for example, we discovered by accident that there was a meeting of the Warren Commission that did not have any records in the National Archives. You couldn't know it wasn't there because you didn't know it had occurred. And actually, what happened was Gerald Ford described it in his book, Portrait of the Assassin, and suddenly people started scrambling to say, "What's this meeting he's describing?" There's no record of that. It's a little like in the early days, sometimes they would put uh, a notation like Jackie Kennedy's testimony, there's a set of brackets that say reference to wounds deleted. You have no idea what that is. Is that a page? Is it 2 pages? Is it a paragraph? Is it a sentence? What's deleted? But I was unable to ever find that section of her testimony. I checked with the Archivist of the United States, Robert H. Boehmer. Nobody knew where that was or if it existed. But we do know she gave testimony. It was recorded, and that it was decided to remove it. Exactly when and by whom, nobody knows. Those are among the things that in the case that pop up all the time, go way back.
When you examine the Warren Commission, Alan Dulles is obviously a name that really everyone focuses on because there's high suspicion around him. But what about the suspicion with like Gerald Ford? I mean, he's doing a lot of weird, unethical things when it comes to the JFK assassination.
Ford is one of those people I got to admit I don't fully understand. He's to me a character I just do not understand. I mean, a quick vignette. I had the opportunity to meet him years later at an event in Minneapolis where he came as a speaker. Of course, we were all wishing that Betty Ford was with him because she's a hell of a lot more interesting to talk
Did he
with. But
smell like sulfur?
I'll tell you, I couldn't engage him in conversation to save my life. And you got to remember, I was a consultant to Elliot Richardson when he was Secretary of HEW before he became the Attorney General during Watergate. And so I had actually, I led off with that kind of thing to see if that would engage him in conversation. My sense of him, at least by the time I met him in the early 80s, was that the old statement, he played too many games with his helmet off his football career. But Ford clearly served as an informant to the FBI and leaked things. He was certainly sort of cover-up minded. I still believe his theory about the case, is that Marina turning Lee Oswald down for sex the night before was the reason Kennedy got killed.
That's really his theory? No way.
That's part of his theory. Yep, that's that.
Well, why do you think they
And
needed
his
an
lifetime,
informant?
the lifetime commitment to communism was always there with someone like Ford.
Why do you think that they needed Ford as an informant if they had Alan Dulles on there?
Well, FBI versus CIA.
Okay.
Alan Dulles is his old CIA buddies. You got to remember, CIA and FBI don't get along. And back then, especially with Hoover running the FBI, they were at odds constantly. One of the reasons we have some of the information we have is the various agencies like the Secret Service, the FBI, the CIA, they were fighting with each other. And each was covering its own ass and at the same time quite ready to sideswipe the other. Certainly the original FBI report on the autopsy, Seibert and O'Neill's memo to Hoover, reflects the fact that they started out doing some kind of an investigation that quickly ended, but I doubt that CIA wanted all that information out there.
So it was basically covering their own ass to see if Alan Dulles on the Warren Commission was going to point more blame towards the FBI or maybe get some exposure on some of their files. And then if you look at J. Edgar Hoover, Gerald Ford was there to make sure that didn't happen and maybe point more towards the CIA.
Yeah, and it's a reminder, this is not one big conspiracy. When you deal with the cover-up, it's a whole set of them, some of which are competing with each other because the choice of Oswald as a patsy was brilliant. You can connect him to just about everybody. And so everybody's running for cover when he gets arrested. And as soon as he's labeled the sole assassin, they're particularly running for cover because now any sign that they should have known something and warned Kennedy beforehand or warned the Secret Service, anything like that has to be erased. Nobody wants even a hint of culpability for having failed in their duties. So nobody was trying to find out who killed Kennedy. They were trying to find out what their own people knew or did or didn't do, and how can I make that go bye-bye.
Have you ever met something or had one person in history that had so many conclusions to it that just were unfinished? Like, was Oswald in Mexico City? What was he doing handing out leaflets in New Orleans? Was that a psyop? Was he FBI? Was he CIA? It's something that's 60 something years later now. We're still trying to hammer out the details, and a lot of it is very, very confusing. Despite the massive amount of record, there's not really a full on, like, this is 100% factual that he did do this.
Oh, exactly. Well, the problem is he was never really investigated per se. Nobody investigated the JFK assassination and Oswald's role in it. They just plain didn't. They looked at facets of it. They didn't really investigate it. You're right. Look at all of the unanswered questions, even today, about all kinds of aspects of his life. I mean, still debating the photos of the rifle in the backyard. So it is mind-boggling how many mysteries remain, how few things have actually been settled. And it's not made any easier by things like when you take their records on me that I can't even get access to them. I'm curious about what they were curious about. What was it that caused me to be blanked out? What were they even talking about? Why were they interested in me? I'm a graduate student in clinical psychology in Minneapolis. I mean, who the hell am I? Why is somebody looking at me? And then why is the stuff top secret years later?
Well,
Constituted a clear and present danger to the security of the United States? Me? Come on.
do you think it was that fear of communism? Hoover was pretty paranoid about the whole communism thing.
Hoover was paranoid about his own reputation more than anything. You know, communism was his second most important concern. First was public image. And he is easily maneuvered with the public image stuff. As soon as you have any threat to public image of him or the FBI under his control, you can predict he's going to run from it, cover it, do anything he can. I think the interesting thing was it was pretty easy to silence certain parties just because of fear of connection to Oswald. See, that was the trick here. Everybody's running for cover.
Now, in the beginning, there were a lot of theories that, I mean, like 70s, 80s, there's a lot of theories that were coming out. And one that you had mentioned to me that I got a comment on my YouTube channel about, and I had to figure out where have I heard this before, but it was the David Croman story. You had mentioned it in our very first email when we before we did our first chat, and I had to go back and I found it. I was like, there it is. I was like, all right, so it's Mr. Schoener that mentioned it to me. I've never heard of this before. I was hoping maybe you can educate me with it, and then also your involvement.
Very quickly, when I arrived in Minneapolis, one of the big hot political things going was the American Allied insurance scandal. This was an insurance company who was allegedly engaging in consumer fraud. But some of the officers of the company were major political figures. You could connect to especially liberal wing of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And Hubert Humphrey, of course, running for president. Um, so eventually, so this is hot stuff. In any event, a man who was a key player in this thing who emerged was David Croman. Now, Croman had been somewhat active in the DFL party, but nobody seems to know a lot about him. It turned out he was circulating a secret manuscript that had never became a book entitled The House That Hubert Built, which was an attack on the liberal side of the Democratic Party in Minnesota. So what does all this have to do with the Kennedy case? Well, that was the weird part. This was going to be tried in federal court. They had to move the venue to Fargo, North Dakota. And Croman was subpoenaed to testify. So he was heading to, now, prior to that, he had made some kind of a public announcement that he was going to hold a press conference about the truth behind the JFK assassination. People are saying, where the hell does this has nothing to do with Minnesota or anything else. What the hell's going on here? Well, on the way to the federal court in Fargo, which is a long distance from Minneapolis, Croman went off the road or was run off the road. His car was in a ditch. He was somehow law enforcement got there. There was apparently some strange items in his trunk. And that press conference was never held, but they sent him for a psychiatric evaluation. Now, this could easily have been done somewhere in Minnesota. And in fact, he had in fact been evaluated here. But they sent him to the Federal Prison and Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. Now, also there at the same time was Richard Case Nagel and Abraham Bolden. And I was later to get information on what was going on in there. But here's Croman in there at the same time as two fairly key figures in the JFK assassination. Well, in any event, when I gave a talk on the assassination, I can't remember how we got in contact, but he got in contact with me, and he talked about having been to Dallas, and like he was an investigator who had investigated the case for whom it wasn't clear. And what the link was to the DFL and his whatever he was doing in the way of political sabotage, all of that was totally unclear. But at a later date, after I had met him and was having interchanges with him, he had mentioned going to Dallas and meeting with H.L. Hunt's organization, H.L. Hunt being the oil millionaire. And Harold Weisberg developed a connection with Paul Rothermel, who was Hunt's chief of security, and put me in touch because he had a bunch of questions of me. They weren't originally about Croman, but he mentioned Croman. And apparently, Croman did go there using the name Don Morgan. And it's confusing. There are a couple of Don Morgans in the Kennedy case. He fingerprinted him off a glass straight out of a movie. Gave him a glass of water, which of course in Dallas, you get a warm climate. Gave him a glass of water and then took it back in and had it fingerprinted and identified him as David Croman. Hunt's people had access to all kinds of ability to check things. But in any event, he apparently was down there shortly after the assassination, did meet with Hunt's people. I don't know what transpired. But so he becomes this very mysterious person who's some kind of a political saboteur and who claims a bunch of knowledge and who has had these unusual situations of being the being in the psych eval, by the way, in Springfield was after he had announced the JFK assassination stuff. So it wasn't like that came out later. Okay, the next piece was that he stayed in touch with me at one point, and this relates to the Boxley story. We had discovered by accident, come upon the fact that there was a former CIA pilot named Jim or Vince McNabb, who may have given different names, who supposedly worked out of Garrison's office or was doing some missions for him, an investigation in Mexico, and gave two young women from Minneapolis, if you can believe this, a message to send to Nagel in Leavenworth. And I didn't know he was in Leavenworth, but he had been transferred to Leavenworth. And they happened to attend the talk. And when I mentioned his name as just one of the many mysteries in the case, these two women kind of lit up and talked to me afterwards and said, well, they had met this guy in Mexico City. So anyway, they're telling me this story. So anyway, to make a long story short, we decided to try to investigate what the hell this was, and was this guy really working for Garrison and stuff. And it led to realizing there was all kinds of shit going on in New Orleans with investigations were hard to understand, and there were people that were not telling the truth about this guy, Vince or it wasn't it was Vince or Jim Rose. In any event, this is a convoluted story because the story really is convoluted. In any event, I actually ran it past Croman, and Croman claimed to have knowledge of this guy. And at the time, I was a little off my game. I was recovering from a serious beating I got, which cost me the vision of one eye. I was actually staying with friends and kind of vulnerable and not not top of my game. I was still struggling with regaining
Why'd you
vision.
get
And
beat? Wait, what happened?
this was an incident in a park. I was out going to watch fireworks. I heard a woman scream. I ran, it was dark. I ran down to find out what was happening. There was somebody being beaten who was clearly on the ground. I couldn't tell exactly what was going on, but a bunch of kids were beating somebody. I didn't know if it was the woman who screamed or what. And I jumped in front of these guys, and it was, I'm not a particularly brave person, but I just was a human being being beaten. And I just screamed, "Stop." And these kids were so freaked out that this guy had leapt in the middle. And I backed up against the guy to feel him with my foot to see if he was moving, because I planned to run. I wasn't going to take this gang on. I mean, I just was trying to break up what's going on. And unfortunately, I got hit from behind, and then I got knocked down, and I got beaten. Ended up blind and crawling blind about 200 yards to the foot of a police officer. Police were by then there. And turned out there had been a whole bunch of these racial incidents occurring in Minneapolis that the newspapers hadn't been printing, which may have had to do with Humphrey's presidency or presidential bid. In any event, my life had just changed, and I was not feeling very good about much of anything. But I was following up still on some Kennedy stuff, and I had a young woman who was having to drive me around because I couldn't drive. And she was present for this meeting with Croman. And Croman gave a fallacious description of this guy, this CIA pilot or former CIA pilot. And then I suddenly realized he shouldn't have given a description. He was clearly trying, if he really knew who the guy was, he was throwing me off. And it wasn't a description that was like average height, average build. It was one of an overweight guy and some other stuff that was absolutely not true, but not what you give someone if you were trying to be unclear about it. In any event, I think he suddenly realized that he just stuck his foot in it, because if I had any knowledge of this guy, I would know whether he's telling the truth or not. In any event, he then got kind of feisty with me and said, this is kind of dangerous business. And he referenced one of his own staff who allegedly got killed or died, and said, I don't think you want to stay in this line of work. And I can't remember all the words, but I felt like he threatened my life. And I don't experience that normally. So I turned to Elaine. I said, afterwards, I said, "Elaine, what did you hear?" She said, "I think he threatened your life." I said, "Well, I'm not top of my game right now, but that's what it felt like." In any event, Croman was engaging in some kind of investigative work in Minneapolis. And he said something about Glenwood Hills Hospital a couple of times. Now, that hospital was serviced by the Minneapolis Clinic of Psychiatry and Neurology for its psychiatry. I worked at that clinic, so I actually knew the psychiatrist going there, and I myself would go there at times to do psychological testing. And I followed him one night to work. He was working as like a night janitor or something, and he had a lunchbox, which I saw him put a camera in. So he was taking a lunchbox with a camera in it into that hospital. I have no idea what he was doing, and I obviously did not follow him into the hospital or anything else. I'm not a undercover agent, but I thought, holy, what's going on here? So I talked to my colleagues and said, who's been hospitalized there? Do you know anybody of political anything political. Is there anybody in there that matters, or there's anybody who's been there in recent years? Because these guys would know any high profile patients. They said the only two things they could think of was there was a relative of Hubert Humphrey who had been in there, and also there was a mafia hitman. Those are the only two people that anybody could imagine anybody would want their records on. So we have no idea what he was doing, but the fact is this guy is, so you see, he's a strange individual. I don't know what the hell he was up to. I don't really know who he is. He's deceased now. We checked his background, and Gary Severson, who you've interviewed, is one of the people that looked into him quite independently of what I was doing.
As soon as you said Minnesota, I was like, all I'm thinking about is his experience. And then you said North Dakota, and I was like, there's another one. Thought of him too.
Well, the other thing that happened was that when I appeared on a radio show here, Boone and Erickson, which is one of the most popular interview shows on WCCO, the CBS affiliate that's by far the biggest audience at the time. They had the switchboard lit up for hours after. They said it was the largest response from the public they had ever had, and they had absolutely promised that I'd be back on again. Well, I never was. And fortunately, my son's godmother is a personal friend of one of the people that interviewed me. And he told her that after I appeared, Bill Williams, who's an FBI agent out of the Minneapolis office, but who I believe at that time had already retired, came to see them and basically gave them the word that I shouldn't be on again. So what was interesting about that was that upon hearing this, I sent the message back and said, I'd be pleased to appear with Mr. Williams. In fact, you may not realize that, but I've got 43 pages of documents, most of which have his signature on them about the JFK assassination. So you might be interested in how JFK assassination comes to Minnesota, because this has nothing to do with me. These are all documents. And, again, the case is complicated as hell, and no matter where you go, it's there. I did not expect when I came to Minnesota to have anything about the assassination. I mean, but so who is David Croman? We don't really know. He was up to something, but what and on whose behalf? We don't know on whose behalf, nor do we have particularly good theories about it, to tell you the truth. We're just plain not sure. I've talked with Gary Severson about it. We don't know. It's interesting because a state legislator who was part of looking at the some of this stuff later is living in the same seniors residence as my mother. And so we actually had lunch to talk about Croman and American Allied and that whole thing. And his basic thing was that there was no question that was in part an absolute trap for a number of key political figures. It ended some careers, and it made the DFL governor at the time somewhat radioactive. I think LBJ appointed him to ambassador to Iceland or something. But so we don't really know. Again, the whole thing is, an enigma inside of a mystery inside.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That's the whole assassination. But do you believe that there's been political figures or people that, like, why didn't Trump release records? Why does every president say that they're going to talk about releasing records when it comes to the JFK assassination and end up not doing it? It was one of the reasons why it was trending was there was an Italian interviewer on some show that interviewed Trump or someone that knew Trump. And he said, if you'd seen what I'd see, you wouldn't release it either. And everyone's talking about it. All the news medias are talking about what did he mean by that about the JFK stuff. And it goes back to like Nixon's remark about the Bay of Pigs. Like, come on, you know something, spill the beans. But it
Well, we
seems,
know that Nixon used it as a blackmail threat that he put all that out. I don't know. I think the interesting thing is that Trump is down on the intelligence agencies in an endless battle with them and trashing them, and is not tight on security. So I was fascinated that he went back on it, because that you would think that'd be an easy promise to keep, and that Trump would be just the kind of person who wouldn't think twice. So yeah, you wonder what it is. The other reality here is that, remember that there are different plots that people discuss, and whatever piece of it you've seen, there can be some deadly things about one party. But if you knew the total picture, you would realize that's actually not the main issue. Vince Salandra used to talk about the 1, 2, 3 assassin game. He said, your backup plan is there's a collaborator. Your next backup plan is it's Cuban refugees. You got all kinds of groups that you want to put in the driver's seat, or could be used to say, well, yeah, there was a conspiracy, but it was just these two guys or just these three people. Um, Anything that limits a look at the bigger picture. So,
do you believe that there's any suspicion around Richard Case? A lot of people that I've spoke to don't really focus on him too much, but I know Dick Russell has done great work. But there's a couple things like shooting off rounds into a bank ceiling just so he had like a, I don't know, an escape or just a cover
well,
story for where he's at.
see, that's the core claim doesn't make any sense to me. Why would you want to be in police custody? You want to leave the country, you want to hide. I can think of a lot of things. The last thing I would think is to put yourself in any kind of incarceration. I mean, let's face it, getting someone killed in jail or prison is not exactly hard to do or a new idea. So why would you ever want to be in custody? That makes no sense to me at all.
Well, so they couldn't use him as a patsy.
Well,
We only think that Oswald, there's been no other look for another conspirator, but there could have been a point where they could have looked for a second helper, and that could have been the other escape route out instead of dealing with the actual who did the deed or who was responsible for this organized plot against Kennedy.
yeah, I understand that, and I don't discount that line of thinking, but I would just point out that again, it makes no sense to end yourself up in prison or jail. It just makes no sense at all. And look at what happened to him. Now, I will tell you, he did not get, from the information I got, he was not mistreated in any way, and was did pretty well in prison, unlike Abe Bolton, who was drugged out of his mind. And again, a man who was in the prison psychiatrist's office described the radical difference in how the two men were being treated. But the other thing that was interesting, when Nagel got out of prison, within a week, he was in East Germany, and eventually brought back to the United States in a spy swap. I mean, that's crazy. And so intelligence connections are there, and the aftermath after prison does not suggest to me that this guy was out of favor with anybody.
Do you believe some of the theories? Like, there are some profiles that people mention about rogue elements of the CIA where I'm like, their profile is too damn perfect. Like William Harvey, David Atlee Phillips, this kind of force. I mean, there's definitely suspicion. I do believe some of those operations, but there's a lot about them where I'm like, their profile fits everything you need when you need it.
Well, that's true, but I think the other piece is this. Um, let's say a core group of insiders set it up and had it happen. But everybody else in that agency is going to want to cover that up. The powers that be don't want that out. It's just like, let's say with Hoover, that the FBI was not complicit in any way, but they did crappy work. And They were using Oswald as an informant. Uh, they're running for cover. And, here's Hoover, loved to blame the communists, but at that juncture, that had the potential for targeting Cuba or Soviet Union. You got the bombers up in the air. It was pretty scary. A lot of things could have happened in those moments. So again, I think it's a time where people run for cover. They're scared to death that the credibility of the United States government is going to be called into question, and individual agencies are covering their own asses. I think that was really brilliant was using Oswald as a patsy. I'm not saying anybody could have planned it way back, but once somebody picked him, boy, did you have a perfect candidate. He's not super bright. He's not somebody who's going to think his way through it. He's going to know he's in trouble. I believe he thought that he was going to turn out to be a type of hero, that once it was revealed he was a CIA operative and had been an FBI informant, he'd be seen as sort of a James Bond and not really connected to the killing of Kennedy. I'm not a believer that he was in some way part of a plot or infiltrated a plot or anything like that. I don't happen to buy that, but is that possible? Of course it is. Of course it's possible that there was some contact. And I also do not believe that the information from Prairie Rousseau and the others about Oswald in New Orleans tells me that had anything to do with the actual killing of the president, or it may have had to do with him being set up. It may have to do indirectly, but I don't believe those discussions are a plot. And I don't believe that in that kind of a setting, you plan the killing of a president.
Did you have Well, did you ever believe that there was any authors or researchers that were out there for deceptive strategies or tactics to kind of root people away from maybe a actual lead or pursuit? Like Joan Mellon, even Garrison's investigation can be examined through that lens when you look at like how focused he was into it. You eventually start running down little roads you don't need to be really going down. You're getting away from the main point.
And that was exactly what with the Boxley thing. What got exposed is we really got Vince Salandri to go down and look at the files and look for certain things and things that concerned us. He found a lot of things of concern. They asked Boxley to come in and have a discussion.
Who's Bill Boxley? I gotta know.
Bill Boxley, aka William Wood, is a former CIA employee who I believe lost his career due to alcohol problem, and may well still have been in the agency after he supposedly was gone, in that there were college students that approached Garrison that claimed he tried to recruit them for CIA at a time period that was after when Boxley supposedly left the agency. He expressed an interest and desire to help Garrison and became one of those people that became a key investigator, right? Did all kinds of stuff. What Vince found and what we suspected was they were going in all these crazy directions. Boxley's name was on a bunch of them. There was a struggle there was a big response to what we did. But what happened is Boxley never showed up and never came back. I'd only met him once when I went to New Orleans. He showed up to do nothing but try to pump for information as to why I was there and what it was I was going to share with Garrison. He's a shifty guy, silvered sunglasses, no wallet, money in a clip. I mean, this was straight out of a James Bond book. And we were meeting, if you can believe it, having breakfast around the pool at the Fontainebleau with Harold Weisberg. But Boxley was defended by Penn Jones, who believed Boxley had all of the answers and clues. And Mary Furl didn't exactly defend him, but she said she thought that a lot of these tangents were coming from Garrison, not for him, and he was just a dutiful servant. and that some of the behavior we saw was that she believed he still had some alcohol problems. This was alcohol or alcoholic related behavior and stuff, you know. But I think the bottom line was that it was relatively clear Garrison had all kinds of things going in different directions. In terms of the authors, you know, the one that I was most focused on was Farewell America, and those folks or people connected with him were very involved with Garrison. I don't know that we're certain of the identity of who the James Hepburn, the author, that's not a real name, was. Weisberg believed he was Philippe de Vosgeli, which I doubt, but Philippe de Vosgeli was, if you've seen the movie Topaz or read the book, he's the Andre Devereaux character in there. It's a French diplomat who was was a friend of Kennedy, and who was the man on the ground in the Cuban Missile Crisis, a key player. If you remember the story, who helped set up the photographs of the missiles and stuff. So this thing got, and the more you look at this whole case, I know I'm traveling in different circles here, but I cannot tell you how this case interacts with so many things. It's mind-boggling.
Well, you're only going to get that when something's been examined as much as the Kennedy case is. You're going to be able to find like this person was related to this person who's connected to this person and this person. To me, it was just like I didn't live at the time, so I have to look for people like yourself who were able to experience it when it happened. But how much have you thought about when it came to information that was leaked from the press to certain investigations, like if it was Garrison's investigation, like the whole Clay Shaw thing, a bunch of confusion that starts happening? I mean, it might take us away from the main point, but of who did it. But is there weight to it? Is it misinformation that was purposely spread to distract?
A lot of distraction. There was a ton of distraction, and I'm sure there are a few people that are lone nuts who who spread stuff that they got into. But the point is, there were much more organized, sophisticated stuff that would tie to something like Nagel, uh, uh, and fundamentally, there was tons of misinformation. And Garrison wasn't an intelligence agency. He wasn't into how you process data. This is not what a district attorney's office does. And his staff were confronted by this onslaught of critics of the Warren Report, not the usual people that they, have anything to deal with. When I went down to see Garrison, I was struck by the degree to which he got focused on a particular theory and so forth. And what I struggled with from the beginning was that there were all kinds of leaks from the office. The reality was Tom Bethel, one researcher, was leaking stuff, gave stuff to Clay Shaw's attorneys. There was all kinds of stuff. The office was like a sieve. When I went down there, having taken some risk in terms of talking about psychiatric records and so forth, which was improper for someone in my field, I was taking some risks. And you know that the stuff that I guarded all those years and took down there, including some original materials from that Mrs. Hoover in Martinsburg, Pennsylvania, I mean, I had some actual evidence
L.E.
that I
Hoover,
handed
right?
them. Yeah, I had things from her that were found in that trash, including things relating to the Silver Slipper Cub of Las Vegas. I had real evidence, and I gave it to Garrison. You know that all of that was gone the day after from his safe. It's just uh, when, but I think that was the scene. I think the other piece was the whole thing had one huge problem, and that was they had to link it to what happened in Dallas. And I believe if there's a link, it has to do with Oswald being a patsy, and this is part of the setup. But to link it to Dallas, they did it with that he carried the rifle in. Now, as Shaw's lawyers correctly pointed out, no critic in the world believes that. That's one of the things that the critics are 100% agreement on, that the weapon that was recovered in a depository was not carried in there by Oswald, at least not that morning. And the reason for it is that Buell Wesley Fraser, beyond being incredibly accurate about the length of the thing, no matter how they tried to trick him, he came up with the right length, estimating it in the air. But the key thing was that he was 100% certain that Oswald carried the things under his arm with
Curtain
the,
rods.
yeah, up in his armpit. And the reality is that the the longest piece of that rifle, the stock, can't possibly fit there. And that, I mean, that was the bottom line. It can't be carried that way if that's what was in there. It's just plain, the package has to be longer than that. But anyway, that's the link to the car. Now, obviously, a case is hampered by its weakest link. You can have a case that's got incredible good stuff to it, incredible good evidence, and then one link may break it. Well, that was the link. The link was to connecting it to Dallas. And I think the issue with the verdict had to do with that. That if I had been on the jury and someone said, is this connected to Dallas? Does this, because it has to be connected with Dallas or it doesn't count. It isn't just that you conspired, it's that the conspiracy was carried out.
Do you believe, well, do you believe that the work of Mark Lane, like, do you trust him, or do you think that he got taken off at a certain point from originally what the main topic is? He's involved in a lot. I mean, Jonestown stuff and all that aside, but being Margaret Oswald's lawyer for Lee Harvey Oswald and then being fired, there's a lot of things about him, and I've seen various interviews, obviously, with him, where I don't know, I can't get the context for him. Apparently, he was just
Well,
interested.
Mark's talk at Cornell uh, was what got me into the case. So, and I've never forgotten that. And I didn't know Mark well. I've met Mark a couple of times. If he came to Minneapolis to speak, we'd get together, that kind of thing. I think Mark did get involved in lots of other things, so it can be distracting. He was here for the Wounded Knee trial, for example. I helped some with the jury selection for that. But he shows up in all kinds of contexts. I think that his original work on the case really broke open a lot of things and was pretty important. I do think, however, when we got together, the last time I saw him actually was a long time ago, was in the spring of 1967. He had just come back from New Orleans. This was the first talk he was giving after New Orleans. And I said, Mark, what's your thought? He said, he's got him. He's really got him. And Mark was not equivocating in any way. I mean, he was very strong. He's really got him. He's got stuff, and he's double-checked the testimony with, questioning Russo under sodium amytal, truth serum. Well, at the time, I didn't know much about sodium amytal. What I was to learn fairly quickly was that it loosens people up. And sometimes you do get truth that way, but it's not a guarantee of that. And in fact, use of hypnosis and truth serum muddies testimony badly and actually can cause someone to be excluded as a witness. And that actually these are significant contaminations to the case. They don't bolster it. But at the time I wrote my article for Ivory Tower magazine in that spring, I commented on Lane, and I commented also on the use of truth serum and stuff like that, because at that time, that's what I believed. But I later realized two things. One is the evidence he had uh, was not super convincing in terms of what happened in Dallas. It was interesting. It needed investigation. It certainly was not something to be ignored, but it did not strike me as at the level of sitting down with trained assassins planning something out. It wasn't of that nature at all. Likewise, the Clay Shaw had a CIA connection, but was it in the plans division? I don't think so. I think again we're remembering the CIA does all kinds of things, um, and this I have never heard that he was in any way connected with sort of the assassination wing. Uh, so again, that whole thing, but initially they didn't know anything about Shaw's connection to the CIA or that kind of thing. So they started out with that he might be Clay Bertrand, uh, and that he might have called Dean Andrews to represent Oswald. That's a possibility. But again, who these players are and what role they have in the killing of the president is so unclear. And it wasn't, once I later saw all the layout of the case, I thought, geez. And Mark, as an attorney, should have asked the question or known what's your statutory requirements in terms of that particular charge. Do you have to show that it was carried out? And the answer is yes. Well, I can tell you, I'm not a lawyer, but I try to put a lawyer's hat on. I would never have described, I would have, based on what he had at the time, I would say, Gary, he's really got some pretty interesting and amazing stuff. I'm not sure how far it'll lead, but it is fascinating. And it's, we, knowing how little we know about Oswald in New Orleans, this adds to that picture, but I'm not sure how far to go. That's what I would say, seeing what they had initially.
What about Adrian Ulpa and some of the stuff that was going on in New Orleans with Oswald?
Well, there's a ton of stuff, and I didn't look into the Adria Alba stuff, but there's a ton of stuff in New Orleans that's interesting. Obviously, the 544 camp, the being in the same building, the anti-Castro and pro-Castro, the whole question of his radio appearance, the John Martin film from Minneapolis, where he appears to have somebody that may be watching him or monitoring him. Something that Dean Andrews told Harold Weisberg quite independently of that film. So, I mean, there were a lot of pieces there. I think clearly he had some intelligence role still
You believe
going.
CIA, FBI?
CIA, I think.
Okay.
But what was it? We still don't know exactly what the Russia trip was. We've got to remember, we know that he probably was part of that program where they were sending over average Americans who had an interest in being sort of undercover. We know that's what the Russians believed he was, but could he have been more of a trained operative? Was he that when he was at Atsugi in Japan? Could be. I don't think we have a way to know for sure. We know, though, he was an agency operative at some points in time. Sometimes people have been on a payroll to do certain things, and they're still assets, but they're not on the payroll. They're not doing any activities. And that's the other question. Does he again get a call to do something? I still believe that in the Texas school book depository after the assassination, that Oswald made a call and got instructions about what to do next. And the whole Texas theater and all those other things, I think, were something he was instructed to do. Would love to know who gave him that instruction and why. I do believe he was meant to be killed in the theater.
I do
I,
too. What's your thought process on that though? Like, how do you come to that conclusion? Because I believe it too. I have the evidence where you have multiple statements from witnesses that were in the theater talking about him getting up and sitting next to random people in the theater. So you can't find necessarily the Cold War spy tactic of half a ticket stub or whatever box top and holding it up, which it's a Cold War spy tactic. You can get it from an academic's journal on it, but you can't have like a document that's going to tell you that's their operation manual because it's secret for a reason. So they're not going to give you that. But any evidence to support that theory is based on testimonies and things of people saying he was getting up and sitting next to random people in the theater. And there were two Oswalds technically arrested in the theater, or two lookalikes, or one lookalike and then Oswald.
well, again, uh, the main thing I took away from the whole thing, other than it makes no sense for him to have gone there and done that, or to have a weapon on him unless there was a reason. That somebody told him to do that. That Oswald, to our knowledge, did not walk around with a weapon in his everyday life. Those are not, and that was not a period in time where the average person did that. Today that might be less unusual in Texas, um, but I think the other thing was that the number of police that ended up at that theater, where allegedly the call-in was about somebody entering without paying for a ticket. It makes no sense. And I got in touch with a guy, I think his name was Willis, who photographed the crowd outside the theater. Was curious about what was there, and he recalled someone saying that that guy killed the president or something else. That was now that could have been a buzz created by just the fact there were so many police officers there. But it was apparently some incredible scene with that theater surrounded. Um, again,
But you believe that he was going to be killed there. Why do you think that?
well, first of all, if you were in fact suspected of killing a Dallas police officer and it's a darkened theater and you have a weapon on you, how many times is somebody going to come out of that alive? And he took the weapon out, but it's supposedly jammed.
Yeah, because the overweight cop stuck his webbing of his thumb and his forefinger into the the trigger guard, so he couldn't fire his gun. I was like, super cop over here.
Why, what, how many times do you think in Dallas that chain of events would lead to somebody being just hauled out of the theater? I
Look at
mean,
their conviction rates. They do a great job.
well, and a cop killer, if that's why they were really there, because we know they weren't there connected with the assassination. Now, again, some of those transmissions and other stuff, are not don't exist at this point. We don't know exactly uh, everything about that, but I just believe he was not meant to live. And then I think they had a problem. They had him in public custody, and the guy wants to make a call and tries to call a CIA guy, and they are able to head off that phone call. Now, we still don't know who the agents were. We know that there were agents who got the operator to lie about it and say that the call didn't go through.
Oh, the rally call.
Yeah.
That was when he was arrested in New Orleans.
No, no, no. This was no. This was um, in the
Dallas
police
precinct.
Dallas precinct. Yeah, he got to make his one call, and it never went through.
Oh, it might be that. I think it might be the rally call. I'm not too familiar with the rally call. I've heard it a couple times in the beginning when I first got into this about that the operators just they did something between the lines and it just the call didn't go through. But it was to a contact that was North Carolina or something like that.
Yeah, that I believe that was the school book department. That was at the Dallas police because he went for his one call, and then we have the reality that for all of her helping of the Oswalds, Ruth Payne didn't seem to cough up an attorney either. I mean, the interesting thing is this guy could be there, have no legal counsel for all that time period, I mean, the police normally want someone to have counsel there so that nobody can claim they did something. Think of the amount of time there. And then, of course, no stenographer's notes of any sort during that time. But they had a real problem. Oswald alive was a real problem. I believe Oswald expected, and his statement, now everybody I will know who I am, did not have to do with the killing of the president. I think it had to do with him believing that his undercover status was going to get put out there, and he was going to be some kind of a mini James Bond. Uh, that's what I believe about. But the issue with Bill Boxley was the going in all kinds of directions. And then when asked to come in to talk about those files and cases, wouldn't do so. Did anybody interrogate him? No, he talked to Penn Jones, but that was about it. And I don't think Boxley was the only problem. He was one of many problems there. It just plain.
I want to go back to one of the things you mentioned, but could you maybe describe some of the truth serum stuff that the CIA had for interrogation purposes? Because it's going to lead me into Jack Ruby. Because if it didn't really work 100% effectively, you had Jack Ruby screaming, basically, get me to Dallas, put me up to a lie detector test, and also that truth serum, you can make me talk. These are statements that he made.
Well, many people believe that truth serum can make you talk, and it can lessen resistance and can, in fact, get someone to babble on and talk and answer questions. It makes you more pliable, as can hypnosis, but it isn't fail safe. And because it doesn't guarantee that what comes out is the truth, it's the same thing as torture. Torture doesn't necessarily get the truth out. For a court, many courts, as soon as you throw that into the mix, say, how do we know it's not, the testimony's now been contaminated. So, but most people believed, and I certainly believed, that it had more ability to sort of get the truth out than it does. But can it assist in an interrogation? Sure. I'm sure there are times when it does. And it isn't just the CIA that has it. I mean, was in wide scale use. And it was used in psychiatry to some degree. There were some people who believed you could find out things about past traumas and stuff.
What about Jack Ruby knowing about it? I mean, was it public information back then? Like, how would Jack Ruby know about these
Oh,
things?
the truth serum was, yeah, truth serum was something out in the popular press. It was not what exactly it was. Most people wouldn't have recognized sodium amytal, but truth serum. And it was, it was something the public had heard about, was widely known about. Not that people knew much about it, but they knew there was such a thing, allegedly. They didn't know how well it worked, but yeah, that was out and about. You could find it in novels and so forth referenced.
Who would you point people towards if it comes to the most respected research in your mind? Someone that you would trust a lot of their research. I always point to Harold Weisberg, but I didn't know him personally.
Oh, you're talking about assassination researchers.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think there's any one party. There are a number of newer books and things out where I don't know the people, and where some of the books I haven't read yet.
I've been sent more emails about all these new books than anything. I'm like, hey, at least people are at least coming across me talking about it.
Right. Well, but I don't. There are some things that particular people are good on. Uh, Harold in some areas does a very nice job, but it all varies. And one of the problems you have in some areas of the case is with regard to the autopsy, the X-rays and photos. Got to go back to the reality that there's a question about the authenticity of some of these items, and chains of custody are not well established in all cases. And so when I accompanied Cyril Wecht David Lifton and I went with Cyril Wecht to the National Archives when he got to look at those things for the first time. I'll never forget. I don't know if we've talked about this before. Okay. Well, Wecht finally got permission to go see the x-rays and photos, but nobody else was allowed in. So David and I were upstairs and used the in-house phones to communicate with him. And David had done something very smart that nobody thought of before then. He prepared a series of plastic overlays with, you know, lines on them, like graph paper, but see-through, that you could put on top of an X-ray, and you could actually then,
Oh,
with a pen,
transparency sheets?
yeah, they were transparency sheets. Yeah, they were great because you could put them over there, and we thought we could map the head fragments. That was the one area that we thought might really help. So David had been smart enough to think about doing that, brought a whole pile of them for Cyril. And Cyril's only, commitment to us was that he was going to do a scientific article based on it. I said, we really need a scientific article, peer-reviewed journal kind of thing. And I'll never forget the first call from the room. David and I were both talking to him, and Cyril said, holy shit. He said, Fisher and the other panelists that say these things are clear, that's a total crock of shit. When I looked at the throat wound, you cannot see a throat wound. You see a tracheostomy scar. If somebody tells me there's a throat wound there, I can say, yeah, there certainly could be, but that's not obvious or apparent. They make it sound like it's really clear when you look at it. It just plain isn't. And what its exact size and so forth before it got mutilated with the scar, remembering that Doc said they used the puncture wound as a place to go in, which makes sense. It's enlarged it. The other thing that Cyril said, we said, what about the brain? He said, oh my God. He said, and he stopped, first of all, he said, look, let me be clear. There is no way for me to say that these are authentic. I have no way. We really need a question documents expert to see if we can prove that these are actually from the JFK autopsy. And as you probably know, there's been a lot of controversy about the x-rays and photos, including with interviews from the technicians that took them and so forth. But in any event, he made a clear point of that and then said, but let me go on. The head has a couple big fragments, but he said, it is not what I was prepared for. He said, there is a film of metallic particles. It's like tiny ones. It's like a whole big cloud of metallic particles. He said, that's not something I've ever seen before. It's not just that there's some bullet fragments. There's all this metal that's fine and dispersed. Now, we didn't discuss it at length. Would a mercury fulminate bullet or something like that create that? But he said, yeah, he said, I didn't use those overlays because most of what I saw was this cloud of metal, not some distinct fragments. He said there are fragments, but it's the cloud of metal that is more striking. Well, obviously no one had suggested that before. Now, did he see the same x-rays and photos that the Fisher panel did? Who knows? But what Cyril saw was something that certainly it's not then just about whether he got hit in the head by 2 bullets. One of those things was exploding, and not like a dum-dum with fragments, but dust. That's mind-boggling. And I don't know that I've seen anybody analyze or discuss that. Okay, again,
He took the x-rays and he found out that there was this little metal thing that pops up in the x-rays to prove that there was something that they obviously should have been able to point out that they didn't. And I think there's the real x-rays and the fake x-rays are both in the archives. That medical stuff gets me very confused because there's a lot of missing pieces of brain matter and just discrepancies on certain things.
Well, the irony is you look at things like Nixon, they or Lincoln, they had to disinter his body and do another autopsy. And then you have, even when Stalin was killed, they made sure there were some ranking civilian pathologists present for his autopsy, that it was definitely not, there was some level of accountability. Cyril always points out that within an hour's time, he and a number of other world level pathologists are an easy distance from Bethesda. They could have had the top people in the country there instead of someone who's unqualified to do a forensic autopsy. You have two, Humes and Boswell are not qualified.
That's why they
And,
brought Fink in.
and they bring Fink in, who was not, he
He
was
wasn't active.
qualified. Well, oh, he qualified, but at the low end, he's not used to doing it. At least he's forensic.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they at a place that would have been easy to have the top people in the country there, they were excluded on purpose, clearly. And just like the orders to not dissect the wounds and things like that, that's bullshit. So it started out with a cover up shortly after the killing. That same day, the cover up was rolling. Now, who directed that? How was it directed? I don't know. Hoover wasn't in on it, obviously, since his guys are part of the reason we know about some of this. Siebert and O'Neill description where the back wound was and things like that. So anyway.
Hopefully we get truth one day, but I don't know. Keep talking about it until eventually everybody's talking about it, right?
Well, and the hope is that there are journals, there are people's handwritten notes, there are memories recorded in paper, because we're at a time when most of the principals are deceased. And you can't ask those questions anymore. But the question is did people write things down way back that it's going to be discovered? Does somebody have it in a box that's going to be open in 100 years? Does somebody's kids going through their dad's or mom's stuff find things? I mean, that's the hope.
If you're a researcher with files, I'll give you my email address. Just be more than happy to send some of those files my way, please. But Mr. Schoener, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show again. It's always a pleasure. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Uh, I I know if you I don't do any I don't have a website or anything like that related to this. I mean, so if they want to get in touch with me, I'm at fairly simple G as in Gary, G.R. Schoener, Schoener at AOL.com. There is a bunch of stuff up on the internet. My article, Legacy of Fear, and I think a bunch of other things have found their way up there. So probably if you Google my name and JFK, you'll find some stuff there. The notes that Tom Bethel created in Garrison's office before he fled include notes about my visit to Garrison, which he was not present for, but he was in the other room. Apparently did notes on them. If you Google my name and JFK, you'll also find that. I didn't know about that till the internet came along and that stuff got posted.
Well, I appreciate the time, Mr. Schoener, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next.